Welcome back, everybody. We're going to take a quick look at an analysis of the New Deal and how FDR handled this topic that we've been dealing with for the past few videos and lessons. We now need to take a step back after we've really gone into the issues and how it was done and all of the broad sweeping things that are part of the New Deal and even Hoover's response to the Great Depression, to really look at, was this successful? What were the ramifications of it, good and bad? So if you want to think of this as a practice APUSH DBQ prompt to really get ourselves in the mind as we're prepping for the exam, think of something like this. To what extent was the federal government's response to the Great Depression successful? You could say it was or it wasn't, and how, provide specific examples. You could say that Hoover's wasn't and FDR's was successful, but you would need to explicitly state how or why or what evidence you have of that success. You could say it wasn't successful at the beginning, but it was at the end. You could say politically or economically it was, and socially it wasn't, or some inverse of those. You could try to argue that for some people it was successful and beneficial, but for other people it wasn't, or that there were varying degrees of success. And it's really up to you to define your path on the arguments for these projects, but that's really where you got to start getting your mind into as we're getting done with our last major, the most expansive unit in the AP curriculum, and we're getting ready for our last major with period 8. So two major things that are going to be in our heads. One, how did Hoover's response and Roosevelt's response kind of differ? Because we're really looking at the after effects of Roosevelt's. And then largely, were there other people that benefited in different ways? And us trying to break that apart. The end of the New Deal. It's really going to lead us right to the end of the 1930s and as we start touching into World War II. The New Deal really hits its zenith, its high point, its apex in 1936 once FDR is elected. Remember, in 1932, FDR is elected for the first time. In 1936, you see one of the largest victory percentages ever in the Electoral College race in U.S. history. There were way more setbacks in his second term in office than his first term, but he was still widely popular. And one of the most basic examples you can point to, look at this Electoral College map. Only 2 states he does not win. He wins states in the West, in the North, in the South, in the East, all over the map. He wins 98.5% of the Electoral College votes. The only ones he does not win Vermont, and he does not win Maine. But other than that, he wins 523 Electoral College votes to 8. And in this, you really see the reason why. When you look at the actual voter turnout and voter totals, there is a Democratic coalition of voters. Southern voters, Western voters, urban voters, those in labor classes, ethnic groups, African Americans, the poor, all coming under this banner that are seeing themselves represented and see supporting this more beneficial. But despite all of these successes, one of the biggest obstacles to FDR's initiation of the New Deal and pushing it forward is really the Supreme Court. Because remember, there's a balance of power. The Supreme Court can, all the way since Marbury versus Madison in 1803 during Jefferson's term, has the power of judicial review to shoot down rules that are deemed unconstitutional. And while these elections have taken place, those that are appointed to the Supreme Court serve for life, right, until they die or they quit. So of the 9 justices, all of them were very old, white men. Only 3 were relatively sympathetic to the New Deal. A couple of them were unpredictable. 4 of them were actively against it. So he does not really have a strong majority, and majority rules. If 5 of these 9 justices vote no, majority rules, any of these things could be shut down, and 4 are already in the no camp. So it only takes one of those swing voters or any of those sympathetic voters that could possibly switch. And you see a similar trend to what we have seen since the end of the Obama administration, where the Supreme Court and who goes in the Supreme Court is wildly impactful. The Trump administration in his first term was able to appoint multiple Supreme Court justices, and that has lasting effects. Those justices will stay there for decades. That's multiple presidencies. One Supreme Court justice even planned on retiring in 1932, but once FDR was elected, he remained in his seat because he felt that FDR was, quote, unfitted and unsafe for the presidency. So the weaponization of the Supreme Court and who is going to be on the Supreme Court becomes a major issue. So much so, the Supreme Court ruled both the NRA and the AAA unconstitutional as oversteps of power of what the government could or could not regulate. And so FDR starts coming up with various solutions. One of them, which is to push through Congress, what becomes known as the court packing scandal. It's not illegal. The Biden administration suggested it in early, I think it was 2021. Where they wanted to possibly increase the size of the Supreme Court. There is no law that says there needs to be a certain number, but for most of our country's history, 9 has been that magic number of Supreme Court justices. The suggestion was one new justice should be added for every justice that's over 70 years old, bringing the total to 15. This would allow him to get more sympathy on the Supreme Court, ideally blocking any opponents from being able to shoot down his New Deal agenda, because remember, the president would appoint the Supreme Court justice, and the Congress would have to approve, but the Congress at this time is very democratically leaning. So you see a lot of cartoons criticizing this. Even FDR is being checked. There is a massive increase in presidential power and federal power during this time period, but is not gone without being checked. You see criticism of FDR only looking for yes men. And even this one, which is a strong lean cartoon, this idea of reorganizing the government, a pro-Republican cartoon, that's revising the Supreme Court is just one step closer to him being a dictator at a time when autocrats are rising all around the world. That even FDR is accused of being lumped into this group, despite being seen by most historians and people even today as one of the most successful presidents, one of the most consequential presidents. But every president has opposition all the way from George Washington forward. Even the most popular ones or have the most popular political power, there is complexity to what is happening. So this was legal, but again, scary precedent. And so there was pushback back and forth between these branches, but eventually a compromise is struck. The court packing move is shut down. A different series of laws like the Wagner Act and the Social Security Act were deemed constitutional. The Wagner Act is what legalizes and protects the right to form unions, so rights for workers, and Social Security helps those that, in this context of the Great Depression, had lost everything in the stock market crash, the end of the 1920s. But you pay into this tax your entire life that in theory by the time you retire and you're past the working age that you've contributed to this, that the government will send you a subsidy, a check every month to help you get by. And in addition to that, one Supreme Court justice resigned, so that allowed FDR to put a more favorable justice in, and that kind of balanced out the threats that maybe he was facing or the pushback he was facing. And when you look at the totality of his presidential career, he appointed 5 justices to the Supreme Court. So those 5 are going to have massive implications in the future decades once we start hitting other reforms in the civil rights movement. By the end of the 1930s, we really kind of see the end of the New Deal. Other than the Fair Labor Standards Act, which provided more rights to workers and laborers, especially in the time when there's high unemployment, like we see in the Great Depression, which was very popular. Other than that, there weren't any New Deal programs. Really, FDR's attempt in his second term was trying to balance the budget, reduce some of the spending, especially in the WPA, which led to 2 more years of Depression hardship that continued. But in addition to the budgetary issues and some of the stagnation, one of the causes of that is this attempt to pack the court to try to get control of the judicial branch, more support in the judicial branch. It hurts his relationship with the legislature, that even there are Democrats that take a step back and see that this is too much of a consolidation of power in their opinion. And so that slows down a little bit of the progress. And another reason why it kind of ends in 1938, while most people pin this, is because in 1937 there's a recession, and so unemployment begins to spike back up. And some people feel that this is evidence that during the New Deal movement, during the Great Depression, that this overspending is a result of FDR's policy. And because of that policy, that is leading to the same effects he says he's trying to solve, but it's actually not working. It's a Band-Aid solution. It's going to spike back up. So FDR attempts to reduce government spending, balance out the budget to try to combat this problem he's seeing. And the data suggests a lot of these points to be true. And when we look at the larger data totals, we see that the height of unemployment happens when FDR is inaugurated. We see the end of the Hoover term and things are still climbing rapidly. And so FDR's policies attempt to try to reverse those things. And we see that there is a recovery period from his inauguration all the way through the second term's election in 1936. And then there is a spike back up right about here, right? Right around 1937. That's what we qualify as the Roosevelt recession. However, there is something else we can't ignore, which is World War II. Many look at the New Deal as helping lessen the severity of what was happening during the Great Depression, but what truly solved it was America's funding and manufacturing for World War II. And so that is ultimately where we're going, looking at the impacts and getting ready for the future. So here's really our argument. Here's what we're analyzing. If we're looking at how impactful was the New Deal, or to the extent to which the federal government actually solved the problems of the Great Depression, what we just went over was our contextualization. This is getting into the main part of our argument. One of the best places for us to look if we're trying to analyze how impactful was the New Deal is really to look at the laborers, the workers, because it really is an economic disaster. And so that seemed like the most logical place to start. If you look at union membership in the 1920s, only 3 million people were members of unions. Part of this might be connection to the Red Scare. Unions were connected to anarchism, socialism, and associated with the violence of some strikes and violence that went on. And so those were deemed undesirable and dissuaded people from joining them. Also with the economic prosperity of the Roaring 20s, right? Some people may have seen that there wasn't as much of a need. So of those that did actually join a union, most joined the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. But the AFL barred unskilled laborers, which are laborers that don't have that extra special training and education required. And so not all people are represented. But in 1938, the CIO is formed by John Lewis, and with the help of the Wagner Act, which legalizes and protects federally the right of workers to unionize, it brings more people to the table for collective bargaining, and it forms more unions. We can look at various labor organizations throughout the country. We see the U.S. steel industry, we see the automobile industry, we see all those adjacent industries that are part of those, would be rubber, electrical, metal, and textile industries. So much so that in just 2 years, by 1940, the CIO had more union members than the AFL, over 10 million in total. So there is a massive swing. And so this is not a new thing that there are unions, but this is a new moment where for the very first time, both unskilled and skilled laborers actually had unions. So more and more people are being protected. Women and African Americans largely benefited from this because they make up a large percentage of the unskilled laborers, because right there, even though there are jobs and there's working situations there available for various minority groups, it doesn't also eliminate restrictions in that field, nor does it eliminate restrictions in other parts of society, like education required to get to that skilled laborer status. And so it opens up, right, a broader umbrella for various types of people to be protected. Similarly, the New Deal's Wagner Act helped strengthen unions with federal legislations. It helps organize with the unions themselves, that the unions were taking the action, not just getting the support from the federal government. So it's a combination of both of these things that bring together more strength to the unionization movement. And when we look at that, yes, it's clear to be able to say that there was progress for various types of people, but it is not wholeheartedly, right? It's not overarching reform and wide sweeping, completely turning it on its head. For example, we can look at opportunities for women because of the New Deal, but that doesn't mean all types of jobs are open. Notice these, right? There are jobs for girls and women, as it says they're being advertised for, training efficient workers, but these are for domestic servants. These are for cooks and cleaning services. These are ways to get a job, which is an improvement, but it's not all jobs. It's only certain jobs, right? Notice that household domestic service. So we still see all of that sexism and prejudice, although we've made large strides. We have a federal amendment for protecting the right to vote, and there has been large strides socially and changes and reforms on multiple levels, but it's not everything. The New Deal allowed for unequal wages. There still was not a federal protection blocking all of these problems. Social Security, the NRA, minimum wage laws did little to help women, but there were still gains, right? So it's a little bit of both. This is complexity. You could try to argue one of the other, but if you're trying to go for sophistication and synthesis and deep understanding, you can look at both. You see the first female cabinet members ever, the first female senators, first female ambassadors, first female judges were all appointed under FDR. And so there's all of these things we can point to that are positive and negative. I always point back to one period, right? We look at the Reconstruction period and we come to that core debate of a common DBQ. To what extent did Reconstruction change society? We need to take that complexity everywhere. To what extent did the New Deal actually change society? In some ways it did, in some ways it didn't. So you can have different thesis statements like that. You can go into that complexity really to bring that same energy into your writing, into the exam. So we have an example here, the first female cabinet member, Frances Perkins, for the Department of Labor. First female senator, Hattie Caraway from Arkansas. So we have tangible things we can point to. And similarly, when we look at African Americans, right, we can look at changes there for those groups, but it's always limited to an extent. It's not always a wholesale everything in one way. If you ever see an or a full-scale sweep, generalizations like that, there's always probably going to be some evidence in the contrary. So, did it change anything for African Americans? Racism still existed. Segregation still remained strong throughout the Great Depression. We are decades past Plessy versus Ferguson, which legally allows for segregation. There is still lynching going on. The Depression doesn't change that. It puts African Americans as sometimes the target and scapegoats of issues that are happening in the world. You will see people hired and fired still, but African Americans are going to be the first ones to be cut, and sometimes the last ones to be hired. And when you look at unemployment rate for African Americans, it's almost at 50% when you look at certain points throughout the Great Depression. So you have effects that are being brought to the country, but not all people are seeing the full benefits of those successes. For example, the NRA did allow for unequal pay, like we just talked about with women. And some people said that the NRA actually stand for Negroes Robbed Again, that there are limits, right, to this growth. The AAA allowed for eviction of sharecroppers. Remember, sharecropping is super popular still in the South at this time, and tenant farmers. And that this protected white farmers more and helped white farmers more than it did for black farmers. And so one quote about the AAA is that it's just a continuation of the same old raw deal. Minimum wage laws and Social Securities did go into effect, but they didn't apply to farmers and domestic servants. Farmers, sharecroppers, right? Most of that black population down south, domestic servants as well, did not fall into those protections, and 65% in America were black. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the leading civil rights organization in the United States, says Social Security looks like a sieve with holes just large enough for the majority of Negroes to fall through. Right? A sieve is like a colander, it's like a strainer, where it catches some of things, but it lets other things through. And conveniently, these systems, yes, they do help many Americans, but African Americans are not going to be protected in these. There are still holes and loopholes that leave them out of those profits or those positive impacts. So despite that, there is still support from the African American community for FDR. You have this quote here, while relief and WPA are not ideal, they are better than the Hoover breadline, and they'll have to do until the real thing comes along. It is better than it was, but it doesn't mean all things are better and solved. You do see FDR hire African Americans to key government positions. Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, the first lady, spoke out against racial discriminations, and there are There's one famous example with a singer that is attempted to be barred from the White House, and Eleanor Roosevelt reaches out and helps kind of organize a performance for her. Up to 40% of unemployed African Americans are assisted via the WPA. So there are changes, but it is not as wholesale and wide-scale as you'll see for the general average white community. Here on the right, you see this letter from Eleanor Roosevelt. And so the backstory of this letter in this photograph is Anderson was a singer. She was denied the ability to perform at Constitution Hall because she was black. So Eleanor Roosevelt actually reached out, wrote this letter, and helped organize a larger conference, a larger concert at the Lincoln Monument. So we see examples of progress, and it's a little bit of both. We have to look at both. Yes, there's progress, but there are also limitations to that progress. Let's jump through a couple other groups. For example, let's look at Latinos, Mexican Americans. They fared even less than African Americans. The Dust Bowl led to many whites going into agricultural fields in the Southwest, where a lot of Latinos had lived, whether it be from Spanish settlement and lineage that way, from Mexicans that had lived there pre-Mexican American War and generational, or just different migrants during the Great Depression. So many of them are going to be forced out of their lands. Congress created immigration restrictions and did allow for more deportation of any people they deemed illegal residents, which shoved Latinos off their farmland and allowed whites looking for land to come out and acquire that farmland. They also received very few New Deal benefits. When you look at Native Americans, they were still remaining the poorest of all U.S. residents, but again, there was some benefit, but not all. The Indian Reorganization Act, for example, really kind of shifts government policy from forcing natives as yeoman farmers, these poor independent subsistence farmers, back to allowing them to be kind of unified autonomous tribes and having some regulation, some power over their tribes and reservations. So this is maybe like a very, very belated and very, very small attempt to restore native life. But again, we can look at, is it a attempt? Yes. But does it solve everything? Absolutely not. Nowhere close. And yes, there was some employment through the Indian Bureau. But again, we're looking at the totality of all the changes. Let's look at regions. You look at the South versus the West. Many in the South and the West benefited the most from the New Deal, which is where a lot of need is seen. The AAA helped end dependence on sharecropping and forced more towards a wage-based labor system. The West received more work relief and welfare than any other region in the United States. And we start seeing the expansion of hydroelectric power irrigation programs to help residents in these areas, like the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, right, which helps expand access to electricity, which allows even more modern conveniences to be used in other areas too. So if we're taking a look at the New Deal as a whole and changes and impacts on American life, it only lasted 5 years, right? If we're really looking at it, from 1933 to about 1938, and majority of the laws really came in two spurts. The first year of FDR taking over in office in 1933, and after the midterm in 1935. And so, if we're evaluating different things, I would say that economically, not necessarily successful, the New Deal, which is kind of the one thing it's largely known for. It did help relieve suffering, but it didn't end the Great Depression. Wealth inequality was still largely intact. If we're looking at different points in history from the very beginning to the very end, beginning when FDR takes over, there are 12 million unemployed workers. By 1939, there was still 10 million. So that's a decrease. And maybe it makes things a little bit easier to bear with, but it doesn't solve everything. It was much more successful socially. So when we're talking about things like the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act for unionization rights, the Fair Labor Standards Act, really helped different groups, like the elderly, disabled citizens, labor unions, workers. It did not wholeheartedly help women, minorities, domestic workers, small farmers, African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos. Right? There are all of these subsections that aren't largely assisted by it, but there are still groups that are seeing success. So largely it was more successful socially, but I think the most success you can hang your hat on is political success. FDR's leadership really unifies and shores up a new Democratic Party and voting bloc that you're going to see pop up over the next 3 decades. And his leadership, his optimism really kind of was like a psychological shift. And so for many historians and many looking at this time period, it's the psychological impact that helps lift citizens out of the Great Depression that is the biggest lasting impact. And what really pulls America out of the Great Depression is our next topic, which is the Second World War. So we've made it through another one, folks. We're crushing it to the end of period 7. As always, if you have any questions, reach out. Other than that, y'all, happy studying, good luck, and keep fighting the good fight.